Hello, so it's Michael here, and today I thought I would finally do a tutorial on how to create an inventory system. Now, one thing just to be aware before we do proceed is it's not going to be a quick thing to go over. There are quite a lot of complexities that you have to bear in mind, things like that. So as long as you're happy with that, by all means stick around, and hopefully you'll learn the skills and the knowledge required to be able to create an inventory system that sort of meets your requirements for your particular project. So at the moment I am currently inside a brand new project, so this is just a third person template. I am currently using Unreal Engine 5.4. In terms of the engine version, most of what I'm showing here would be, it should work in most engines. If there's particular nodes that you don't have, normally there'll be another way that you can do something similar. Just so you're aware of that. Now, when it comes to creating an inventory system, there are, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of ways to do it. Now, what I want to try and do is not only show you a different way of creating an inventory system than what I've seen available already that's out there, I also kind of want to explain the underlining logic and idea behind why it is set up the way that it is. So when we actually look at an inventory system and kind of break it down, all it is really is a list of items that you then have some sort of UI display that presents and sort of shows that data for the user, so in this case the player. In terms of the inventory system itself, you would then have logic that helps you essentially move that data around from one place to another. So from one inventory container to another inventory container. It could be that there might be item data stored on an actor in the world, and then that has to then be placed into an inventory system itself, which might be on the player, which you kind of think of like the collection of that individual item data. So when we actually look at the data itself, that's kind of where we need to start. We need to think of the data that we need for the items themselves. Once we've got that sorted, we can then look at creating a system that then stores that data for the individual items and how we want to set that up. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just go ahead and create a new folder within the content browser. So I'm just going to call it inventory system. Inventory system. Just so we've got a folder just to keep everything in, to help keep it nice and tidy. Now, in terms of the way I'm going to store the data, I'm going to use a UObject. For those that haven't used UObjects before, UObjects are kind of like the simplest type of object that you can have within Unreal Engine, assuming you're following their practices. Now, when you go to create a new class, you do get the list at the top for the common ones. Obviously at the top there's the actor. But if you click on the all classes, if it's not already dropped down, you can see a list of all the classes that are available that you can create a child from. And in the list you'll see actor, and this does maintain the hierarchy, so you can actually sort of click down and you can see how that's all set up. But at the very top you get object. So every class that's inside of Unreal Engine is an object, essentially. That's mainly because C++ is an object-oriented based programming language, so that kind of carries into Unreal Engine as well. So things that have behavior are essentially objects. So if we actually go to create a new class and we select the object, we'll call this one item base. Save that. That creates essentially a blueprint that is of type of UObject, essentially. Now, a UObject is as simple as you can go. They are extremely lightweight, which can be quite useful when dealing with items. So when we're using a UObject based system, we essentially create the UObject, so we construct it, and then that contains all the data that pertains to that particular item. And because it's a UObject, it becomes quite easy just to move the references around for what should kind of hold or contain that particular item, because all we're doing is that is just moving what references it, essentially. A few other things just to be aware of, particularly with us using UObjects, is because they are as simple as you can go, they don't have any context to the world. They kind of live in their own space when they are constructed. So because of this, there are some limitations in the sense that, assuming you're using a blueprint-based UObject, they have no context to the world, which means there's certain functions that you won't have access to. So for example, spawn actor of class, we don't have access to that particular function. And the reason why is because for that function to work, it requires context to the world, which we don't have within the UObject. Now, if you're doing some C++, there are ways to add that to a base class. So it is something you could do where you create the item base in C++ and then you create a child of that. But the C++ class has some additional logic in there that gives it context to the world, and that'll give you additional access to those particular functions. Now, having said that, it's not always necessary anyway. The way I like to see it is not having access to a lot of that stuff actually kind of makes you think, oh, should that actually be in here? Because at the end of the day, when it comes to the item base class, it should only be specific to the item. So if it's needing to do anything in the world, chances are that logic probably needs to be somewhere else anyway. Such as the item object shouldn't be responsible to spawning itself in the world in terms of like a representative actor. Ideally, that would be the infantry system potentially that handles that. So it's that would do the spawning as opposed to the item object itself. Now, I know that's probably quite a lot, and I've not really done much as of yet, but as I've said, I do want to try and make sure I'm explaining the concepts behind making the infantry system. And the reason why is because there isn't an infantry system that's kind of like a one size fits all type of thing. You can watch so many different tutorials, and it's very rare you'd find one that does exactly what you want. You're always going to have to be able to manipulate it, change it, build upon it to get it to work the way that you want. So understanding the core concepts of an infantry system will hopefully make that a little bit easier for you. Now, again, so we've got this item base. Now, the next thing we need to do is we do need to then go ahead and add some variables to this. And these variables will just be essentially the data for the item. So, start off, I'll just call it item name. I am going to do this as text. And the reason why is because this is what's going to be used to display the name whenever it needs to be shown to the player. Now, using a text means it can be localized if that's something that you're wanting in your particular game. I'm just going to do the just going to set the default value to no name. This just means that if I ever see no name anywhere, then chances are I forgot to put the name somewhere. Again, at this particular point, when we're looking in the item base, we kind of want to think of the variables as being what should exist in every single item, regardless of what it is, the data that should exist in all of them. So item name, that's going to be one of them. A value is probably going to be another one, potentially, if you're going to be able to sell or buy or sell particular items. I'm just going to leave the default value for that one to 0. I think of all the ones off the top of my head that would be applicable in this instance. We could do icon. So this would be like the 2D texture. So whenever it needs to be displayed within within the UI, we can get the icon that should be used from the item base itself. So when it comes to something like the icon, personally, I would choose a soft object reference. So you can see all the different textures. And the reason why is because when it comes to the icons, they only really need to be loaded when we are showing them within an inventory. So if the player doesn't have the inventory open, then we don't need those icons loaded. Adding to that as well is if you have quite a lot of items in your world and you're not using a soft reference, that could cause the icon textures for every single item to be loaded into memory, even when they're not being used, which obviously isn't something that we want to happen. So using it as a soft reference, we just have to be a bit mindful of that we do have to check to see if it's loaded before we try and use it, and if it's not loaded, load it first and then update whatever icons and things that we want to use. Adding to that, additionally, I was probably going to do item mesh to try and keep it simple. And for this one, I'm just going to go for a static mesh. Again, something similar. I'm just going to use a soft object reference. Again, same reason as the icon. But this just allows us to specify that without it loading it just by the class being created. Now, for the defaults on these, I'm just going to leave them empty. Okay, so I'm trying to think how else I want to sort of structure this. So, if you are wanting it to be just purely data in the sense that you only ever have data in this and all you're doing is reading from it, one alternative you could use instead of a UObject base is actually using a data asset. So, as an example, we can create a new blueprint class, and if we search for primary data asset, and when we open that up, we'll have essentially something similar. So a primary data asset is kind of like a UObject, but it's a bit more refined in terms of its use case. So with that being created, we can then again go ahead and add the various variables. So item name. Again, I'll do that as the text. Do value. Actually, we'll just copy these. There we go. So we'll just copy these from the UObject to this one. Just like so. So when we're actually looking at these side by side, like the UObject based one and the data asset, so far they look exactly identical. Now, using a data asset one, that does allow us to from the, if we go to the miscellaneous section, we create a data asset and we can choose the item data asset in there as a test item. There we go, test item. We can then open that up and we can just set the data directly in there. Now, generally, if you're using data assets, I would tend to treat them as read-only. You can technically modify the data, but that can get a little bit. You can get sometimes get some weird behaviour when you're doing that sort of thing with the data assets, just because that's not their intended use. Generally, with data assets, it's more of just a read-only type of thing. So this is probably more closer to using like the data table kind of approach. But it's kind of like an in-between a full UObject based one and a data table kind of approach. So it's kind of like a data table but without the data table, if that makes any sense at all. But yeah, obviously looking here, so we can go ahead and set those items up and whatnot. Now, again, depending on the sort of game you're making, these are perfectly valid options in terms of what you want to do, in terms of how you want to represent your item specific data. Now I am going to go ahead and just delete the data asset version again. That's just to prevent confusion as we progress in the project. Now the reason I prefer to use a UObject based one is because that does allow us some flexibility in terms of actually being able to modify the data on a per item basis, which again, it might not be something you need. Again, it completely depends on the sort of project that you're doing and what it is that you're wanting out of your inventory system. Now, for me, I like to have that option to be able to modify the data. And for me, what I'm going to do is actually put in an additional variable in here called quantity. And this is just going to be a type integer. And I'm going to move that up near the top. And this is kind of going to represent how many items are actually present within this item object. So you can kind of think of it as, if this number is 10, then there are 10 items with all this data, if that makes sense. But because it's in the item object itself, you can create a new item object of the same type but have a different quantity value in it, which kind of makes it easier when you're wanting to move stuff about. Okay, so with us creating the item base, as I mentioned, this is the data that would be present in every single item. So you kind of need to be selective in terms of what it is that you put in there. Once we've kind of got the base sorted out, again, you can always come back and add additional variables to this as you progress within your project. You might realize that actually this particular bit of data could be handy in everything, and you just add it in. But once we've got that sorted, whenever we want to create a new item, we just create a child of this particular UObject. So if we wanted to, I could come in and create one called item stick. So this is going to be a stick item. It's just a stick. We can open it up, set the values. What I am actually going to do on the base item, I'm just going to set the quantity, the default value to 1, because generally there wouldn't ever be 0 quantity within an item object. That just means that whenever you create a new item base, it's always going to have at least 1 in there. So going back to the stick, again, at this point we are just updating some of these variables. The stick could be valued at 0.01. I don't have any icons or anything or a mesh really to use, so I'll just leave this blank for now. But in terms of this item, you could say that that's it, that's done. Because we are using a UObject based system, we have access to hierarchy. So it might be that you want to start thinking about things like consumables or weapons, tools, armor sets. You know, the list can kind of go on a little bit. So what you can actually do is create new base classes for those new item types. So I could do, so we've got the item base, we'll do item, we'll do consumable. So the consumable base is for anything that would be consumed by the player in some shape or form. Again, in terms of the types of variables that you have in here, there might not be anything new specifically that you want at this particular time, but it can be good to kind of think ahead where possible. You can always reparent if you need to a new item base. Just be aware that you may incur some data loss depending on how you're reparenting it. So with the consumable, I'm just going to leave that how it is for now and just create a new child of that. So you can have another one, which is item food. When it comes to food, you could say that, well, everything that is a food item needs some sort of value to denote how much hunger it's going to replenish. So we can add a variable for that. So hunger replenish. I'll just stick with hunger for now. Hate coming up with names. Again, choose the variable types. So any food that I create is going to have this hunger variable, but nothing else is going to have it unless it is of type food, which is obviously going to be quite useful. When you are doing things such as hierarchy, it can be useful to make sure you are using the categories for your variables and even your functions as well, because it just helps you keep track of which function, which base class it sort of sits in. So I'm just going to put this in a category called food. And if we go back to message on the Discord there, so what I'm actually going to do is on the item base, I'm just going to add these to a folder, a category as well. I'm just going to put in one called item for the main ones, and then for the UI, for the icon, I'm just going to put that one called UI, and then for the item mesh, I'm going to put that one in one called world, just to help distinguish them. And then when you look on the class defaults, they'll have the nice categories. So if we go back to the food item and we look at the class defaults for that, again you'll see that things are in the categories, which can make it a little bit easier to keep track of the variables. So if we come on in again to the food one, we can create a new child of that. So call this one item carrot. create another one, call that one item potato. Potato, we'll just say that as well. So now we've got two, we'll quickly pop some values in here. This will be called carrot. And then this one's going to be called potato. So again, you can update the values of these as well. So potato's worth 2, carrot's worth 1. That could replenish 5 hunger. Potato could be 10. Just like so. No, that's actually food, isn't it? Usually helps if I actually open the carrot one. It's carrot 2. Yeah, well, that's 5. Just like so. So as you can see at the moment, as we've gone through this video already, it probably feels like I've not really done much, but this step itself is actually quite important, because this is how your items are going to be represented in terms of the data structure. And if you end up creating a method that means your data becomes messy or difficult to access, manipulate, your inventory system itself isn't going to be very nice to work with. And adding to that, you'll probably end up having quite a lot of unintended bugs and things just not working the way you want. So it's definitely a good idea to spend some time thinking about how it is that you want things to be structured. A few other things just to be aware of as well that you can potentially do. Whether or not you need to, it kind of depends. But things like the item base class, for example, you could always set it as an abstract class, and that'll just prevent it from being constructible. So you can't construct an item using the item base class, because with the item base class itself might not necessarily function without the data being set up correctly. So what I mean by this, if I go to construct object, if I try and search item base, because it's an abstract class, it won't appear in this list. So if I just untick it again, item base, now it does. So it's kind of depends on how, whether or not you want to do that. It's up to you. Although one thing I will check, but I'm not sure is a thing. Yeah. Yeah. So if it's using the item, so if it is an abstract class, you can still create variables using it. So that's so you can store items in it. You just can't construct an item using that base class. So that itself can be quite useful. Again, depends whether or not that's the sort of thing that you're wanting to do. So I'll just remove these for now. Okay, so that's kind of, I think that's probably where I want to leave this particular episode at the moment. In the next episode, we'll probably look at possibly setting up some getter functions to make it a little bit easier to get some of the data out of the item base classes, and potentially starting work on actually setting up the inventory system itself that will create and house these item objects that we've set up. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you do have any questions, by all means leave a comment. Again, I do have a Discord as well, so if you want to jump on there, the link for it will be in the description. I do try and respond when I've got some time. So I just want to say thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.